What made City on a Hill Season 1 work very well, despite a very, very simple plot ultimately, was that it had this high level of procedural detail and interesting characters and dialogue that carried things through. I think that this season, outside of the interrogation room, there's been a lack of policing, a lack of getting to see DeCourcy doing his job and Jackie Rohr doing his job that I think has hampered this season to a certain extent. Drew here, and I liked this episode. Don't go saying no dying words. I liked it. I thought it was another solid episode, but it struck me this episode that in a story as predictable as this, you really, really need to add a lot of depth in the way that the story is developed. And I feel like because the characters are constantly interacting in settings where there's just not the level of procedural detail of last season, I feel like that has been hampered. I think, if anyone is going to be thinking about anything after this episode, it's the situation with Kelvin and Grace. And it seems pretty clear after Kelvin ends up getting shot while helping Anton to take out the rival gang after they took out the rest of Anton and Kelvin's crew earlier in the episode, it seems pretty clear to me that one of two things is going to happen. Either Grace is going to finally turn on Anton and, allow him to get justice enacted against him because, he's basically, his actions have led to so many deaths and now it's threatened the life of Kelvin. And then it's going to come out after she's abandoned Anton to his fate that Kelvin was the one whose bullet actually killed Rania. And of course, this will either result in Kelvin being sent away to prison to follow Anton, or it will be that Kelvin ends up dying as a result of what Anton has done, and Grace rejects Anton, and only to discover that Kelvin had actually been the one to kill Rania. But either way, I feel like it's going to be something along those lines. I think that one of those things is going to happen. One way or another, it's going to turn out that Kelvin was the one whose bullet killed Rania, which is sad because Kelvin is obviously not a bad kid for the most part. I think that he lacks the fortitude to stand up to Anton and to keep him from following through on his worst ideas. Anton is no Omar Little, let's say. I feel like this is a big weakness of the show, is that instead of focusing on Kelvin and Anton and Grace as characters, I think the show has done some character work with them, but to a large extent, they just fit into pretty neat cliche. And, the show, it's focused more on how these characters, who are, archetypes, to be charitable, we'll call them archetypes, it's focused on how their decisions have affected the community and how Grace's decisions to shield Anton could affect the community, losing them this vital loan that could, lead to growth and more prosperity. But to me, I think that the mistake would be thinking that because you're focusing on these characters and their relation to the community and, a lot of law enforcement issues and issues, to do with the Black community, I feel like it would be a mistake to think that because of that, these characters can't be interesting as individuals. I feel that, The Wire made Omar Little just a very, very strong character, and that's why the ultimate tragedy of that story for many of the characters hit so hard was because the characters were actually people that we knew and cared about in a similar way to like a Dickens novel. If you just use characters as vehicles for the themes that you want to discuss, then it's just not as interesting. And I'm afraid that that's largely been the case with Kelvin and Anton. Anton is just a dummy. He just goes after people again and again, even when there's no point to it and then there's nothing to gain from it. I feel like there was a lack of creativity this episode from the writers in the way that these two gang shootouts played out, because they basically happened the exact same way. There's people in a room, the bad guys, the other gang shows up, bursts into the room, kills everyone, and leaves. I mean, that's a lack of imagination. I think they could have done these in more interesting ways. And it wasn't particularly realistic either, because if you're in a room hiding behind an object and someone bursts through a doorway, typically the person bursting through the doorway is at a disadvantage. But somehow the gang that burst into the doorway in both situations was the one that came out on top. And the way that it played out in the second shootout in particular, I thought it was believable that Kelvin would stay alive by just hiding behind the door. I thought that was a nice touch. Him sitting there not doing anything while the rest of his pals are brutally killed. That was interesting, and I think that had a note of realism to it. But the second shootout, where Anton just bursts in and kills everyone, it was kind of, Anton has been portrayed as like somewhat of an action hero in some ways, and that he's just like seemingly invincible in shootouts. And the fact that, there's this person on the floor that he's shot, and he waits until Kelvin enters the room to jump up and shoot Kelvin, who up to that point hasn't indicated that he has any penchant for enacting violence, instead of shooting Anton, who's already in the room. It made no sense, and it was clearly motivated by the needs of the plot and not by what would have actually happened in a realistic situation. And I'm not saying that I don't understand why writers need to make decisions that aren't always realistic, but there's plenty of ways that they could have written this scene so that it wasn't so silly. They could have had them both go in and just showed Kelvin not shooting back and then had him get shot. To have it play out this way, I feel like maybe was just for budgetary reasons, but still, I wasn't fond of the way that they directed these two shootouts. They just felt too similar and not particularly realistic in either instance. But on the whole, I'm interested to see where this goes. I think it's a little bit predictable, and I feel like the way to salvage that was to make us actually care about these characters and their tragedies, but they're more vehicles for the plot and for the themes that the writers wanted to address, I feel, than actual flesh and blood human beings. The other highlight of this episode for me personally was the conversation between Jackie and DeCourcy in the bar. I feel like these two characters are stronger together, but I think they're the strongest, honestly, when they're butting heads and then grudgingly respecting each other. This conversation, DeCourcy kind of gave a nod to the fact that they're not really friends at the beginning when he said, "What, are we supposed to be friends now?" But to me, the way this conversation played out, they were all together too chummy, and they were bearing their souls to each other in ways that I don't really think fits with the tenor of their relationship this season in particular. But I did find the dialogue very, very strong. I thought that there were some very, very insightful character moments. I thought their exchange about racism, in particular when Jackie said there's no patent on racism, I thought that was a good exchange. And I particularly thought that the connection that these two characters feel over, their children, DeCourcy over his child that has yet to be born, and Jackie over his daughter, and the ways that his decisions have impacted her, and the bonding over the fact that in some ways the decisions that they've both made have had impacts on their children, both the unborn child and Jackie's daughter, who's now considering going to college. And I felt like there were moments here where it felt like a very, very real exchange, even though I'm struggling to buy that Jackie and DeCourcy would be so chummy at this point in the story. Kathy, I feel a little bit frustrated with this character this season. I thought that the moment where she killed Jimmy was one of the better moments of the season, but the character has been basically a holdover from last season that didn't really need to be in this season for the most part. I thought that they were going to link her plot line to Anton and Kelvin for a while, and that would allow those interactions to happen, and that would have been, I think, an organic use of the character. But basically she's found a new connect thanks to Sheik. So basically I don't even understand why she had any interactions with Kelvin and the other members of their gang at all, because it doesn't really seem like it has impacted her storyline in a meaningful way. I also just feel, like I said, I feel like she's a holdover from last season that really doesn't have a lot to do here. I think that this episode spent a lot of time establishing the desperation of her plight and how this has led her into this life of crime. And I appreciate the acting and just the development of the character. I think that they've done a better job developing her character than they have Anton and Kelvin and Grace to a certain extent. But again, I don't know why the character needed to be in this season, except that perhaps they wanted to give the actress more work. I feel like this show this season has the opposite problems with Siobhan and Jenny. In the case of Siobhan, she's been altogether too involved with her husband's career, which I feel like has been to the detriment of his plot lines because it's kind of unrealistic and contrived, but at least it gives her an organic reason to be involved in the story. In contrast, Jenny, when you don't have a character involved with their spouse's career, which is the main part of the story, then you're left with a bunch of random stuff happening. And that's basically what has happened to Jenny this season. You have the whole situation with Maeve, who it turns out is IRA, and this is just really random. Like, it's not like entirely boring or out of left field. It just doesn't feel like something that really belongs in City on a Hill per se to me. And then you've got her solo, which I'm sure they're going to have her sing at a pivotal moment, and it'll be very emotional. And then also her quest to find her father, who up till this point she's thought was dead. But none of these plot lines are particularly interesting, I think, in the context of this show. I like Jenny. I really like the actress's performance, and I think that it's important to have this character in the show to give some context to Roar and what's going on in his life. And as he's made this adjustment to kind of change his behavior, I think it's important to understand what's going on in his home that could be motivating that. But I feel that all the time with Jenny that's not around her, where she's not with Jackie or with the daughter, I feel like to a large extent this is wasted time. DeCourcy, I think to get this season back on track, I think they need to get Jackie doing more investigating and more interrogating rather than, talking to people that really don't need to be talked to, such as Siobhan's mother. I mean, there's not really they gave, an arbitrary reason like, oh, he's trying to dig up some dirt on Grace. But I really felt like, essentially, since she didn't actually give him any dirt and she just helped him to figure out something he probably could have figured out on his own, I feel like that doesn't really seem like a strong procedural moment. I think it just seems like, okay, we're just going to use this actress who we have on, standby as Siobhan's mother. And she's a strong actress, don't get me wrong, but I just feel that it would be more interesting to see Jackie actually doing FBI work, actually investigating the case. We don't get to see people do their jobs this season, so I'd like to see Jackie back on the case, and I'd like to see DeCourcy back in the courtroom. And unfortunately, Guy Dan, has said, and this is really what anyone in Guy Dan's position would say, that there should be no involvement for DeCourcy because he's going to mess everything up. And unfortunately, I think the show's probably going to have him get involved. But I don't know how you possibly prosecute someone who shot your wife. I don't think that there's any way that that wouldn't be a conflict of interest. So I don't really know how the show is going to work around that. But I have a feeling they're going to try to find a way. But they need to find a way to get him involved in the legal aspects, and they need to find a way to get back to the bread and butter of this show, which is the case that the characters are working on. So to me, that's been a major weakness this season, that there hasn't been enough of that. But let me know what you thought in the comments. Those are just my thoughts for what they are worth. If you're interested in seeing upcoming reviews of other shows, please consider subscribing. And as always, thanks for watching.